So, in 1972, in a film produced by DARPA, J.C.R. Licklider, who's one of the most important figures in 20th century computing, complained about paper. "We've been needing for a long time some better way to distribute information than to carry it about," he said to the camera. "The print on paper form is embarrassing. It's just fundamental that if one wants to deal with information, you ought to deal with the information and not with the paper it's written on." And so it's been more than 4 decades since Licklider lodged this complaint. It's been 4 decades in which digital humanists and their allies have been furiously at work on one answer to his complaint: the rapid, vast, and perpetually incomplete project of digitization. So this work of taking paper and turning it into bits and bytes has made innumerable avenues of research possible. And for example, my own work on the cultural history of the Bookmobile would have been pretty much impossible without digitization, digital repositories, full text searching. Right? The archives are scattered and weird in a lot of ways. But digitization has also tended to carry with it echoes of Licklider's cranky utopianism. And so his rejection of paper as embarrassing, his conviction that information and the paper it's written on are different and must be separated. Indeed, large-scale digitization projects can seem to free information from the prison of paper, right, from the tragic and old-fashioned and traditional constraints of the material. But that's a fantasy, right? It's a dream that ignores the contingent, interdependent, and positively messy relationship between paper books and digitized data. So, using the Internet Archive as a case study, I want to argue today that the physical page and the material book persist with crucial effects in digital repositories. And I want to make 2 particular claims about that persistence. First, that digitization is a profoundly material process. And second, that books that are digitized don't always stay digital. And so we'll start with the first claim. So Brewster Colley had founded the Internet Archive in 1996 to maintain a record of the web. But by the time he climbed onto the stage at a 2007 TED conference, his ambitions had expanded to include, well, pretty much everything. "Universal access to all knowledge is within our grasp," he declared, explaining the archive's goal of digitizing all of the published and the unpublished media in the world and making it available for free online. Right? A year earlier, he'd outlined ideas that he said would, quote, "put the goal of universal access to all within our grasp." And given Colley's feverish utopianism, you can get a pretty clear sense of that here, and his obvious debt to Licklider, it might be easy to think that the shift from paper to pixels would be a rapid and clean move from dead trees to electrical impulses. So paper's over, so let's get on with whatever's next. Right? But transitions are never so smooth, maybe particularly when it comes to books. Right? And one of Colley's favorite images, that of the grasp, highlights the material dimensions of his utopian dream. And this is Colley gesticulating madly on the TED stage. So a grasp is finite, it's bodily, it's actually a profoundly undigital image. Licklider, for his part, disdained the idea of only having access to that information which was, quote, "within grasp," end quote. For Colley, achieving universal access, though, means reaching, stretching, grasping. And that reach is digitization, a process that depends intimately on physical bodies, physical pages, and physical spaces. So I'm going to first talk about how books are digitized at the Internet Archive. So in 2006, Colley explained that the archive had tried out some robotic scanners, but they hadn't been reliable. So instead, they went back to what he called, quote, "a simpler system." That supposedly simpler system was an assemblage of metal, glass, silicon, plastic, and flesh, right? And fabric. You can see the nice little curtains there. So in this system, this simpler system the archive settled on, a person sits before an apparatus that includes a cradle with a glass plate that's shaped kind of like that raises and lowers to flatten the book for clarity, bright lights to create an even image, 2 high-resolution cameras, one for verso, one for recto, and they take pictures simultaneously, and a computer. Right? The scanner, who is crucially the human worker and not the machine that usually takes that name. In the Internet Archive, the scanner is the human sitting at the machine, uses a pedal to raise and lower the glass plate, turning the pages as he photographs them and verifies their quality. The scanner's body thus echoes a constellation of older forms of physical material labor. Right? The scanner uses a pedal to power a machine, like generations of garment workers. The scanner raises and lifts a plate, like a printer. The scanner sits, carefully reproducing pages, like a monk in a scriptorium. And it's not, after all, a coincidence that he's called a scanner. The machine is called a scribe. This physicality could end up surprising those who'd bought wholesale the dream of digital disembodiment. And for example, in a 2008 story about the archive's digitization project, Wired magazine warned its readers that, quote, for those picturing an efficient, automated process involving robotic arms and high-tech scanners, the scanning is relatively primitive, requiring monastic diligence to manually turn pages all day. And so perhaps to keep its readers' virtue intact, right, the slideshow Wired put together to accompany the article largely trims out the lived reality of the scanning center. 2/3 of the photographs include no humans at all, reveling in gadgets like cameras and servers, while cutting out the environment in which they sit. Right, you can see some of those here. Even right, where there's a book, it's a book with a tester on it. Right. But the last photo of Robert Miller, the archive's director of books, breaks this pattern by showing a shelving unit, you can see on the right side, right, stacked with overflowing plastic boxes and with a canister of cleaning wipes wedged sideways between the top shelf and the ceiling. Right, with this photo, Wired inadvertently depicted the actual cluttered and very human environment in which digitization, I told you, takes place. Right, the archive itself is less shy about this. In an undated video tour of their facility in Toronto, posted to show how scanning worked, they actually show pretty clearly the embodied humanity at the heart of their digital utopia. The needs of the body are present. One scanner's water bottle sits up beside her left foot, and the camera passes by chair after chair draped with scanners' coats and sweatshirts, which you need outside, while the camera person sidesteps a fan, necessary inside with people working with bright lights and whirring servers. Also, the consequences of so many old books and so many human bodies, all that brittle cellulose and sloughing skin, are also visible as the camera lingers on a disused book truck, holding a roll of paper towels and a Swiffer duster. You can barely see the duster at the bottom of the image there. So for all the claims of those who, like medievalist Michael Camille, decry the distance between the sensual page and the surface-skimming screen, right? The body, sweating, thirsty, grasping, grimy, is, as we can see, central to the production of digitized text. So I want to turn our attention now to what that grimy process produces. So far from simply freeing information from a paper prison, digitization in many ways actually highlights and extends the original physical form of the book. So Bonnie Mack has argued that while the digital page, quote, may imitate the look and behavior of counterparts in parchment and paper, it has its own distinct materiality, end quote. And those of us who saw Whitney Trottin's keynote on Thursday heard her make an argument about digitization producing new material circumstances that were very convincing, right? And these are undoubtedly true, right? Internet Archive books are marked up, they're stored on mirrored servers, and so they take new forms that affect meaning and use. But today I want to take a slightly different approach to suggest that the old form remains crucially influential, even if perhaps inadvertently so, in the life and meaning of a digitized text. So take, for example, emerging communities, integrating networked information into library services, the proceedings from a 1993 conference. So one copy of the book sat on a University of Illinois library shelf for 14 years until sometime in early 2007 when it found its way to the second floor of the library's high-density storage facility, where two Internet Archive scribe stations sit in a small, high-ceilinged room. There, according to the metadata for the book's entry in the Internet Archive catalog, it was scanned by someone named Tricia Leonard, or rather, Scanner Tricia Leonard, as they call her. Flipping page after page, Scanner Tricia Leonard took 324 pictures of the book. And what she recorded, and what is now available through the archive, is not the disembodied content, the abstract information of emerging communities, right? Nor an unspecific Platonic ideal of it. When you open Emerging Communities in PDF, which presents the book as a linear series of pages, or in read-online format, which mimics the codex in what Colley calls, quote, a page-turny interface, end quote, you see images recorded by Scanner Tricia Leonard's cameras on that day in 2007. And Whitney, on Thursday, argued that this returns a perpetual present. And today, I want to supplement that and say it returns a perpetual history of a physical object. Because you see the particular history of a particular copy of the book. And I want to walk through 2 pages in order to think through how that worked. So the third image in the file tells us a great deal about this physical book's physical history. The Internet Archive is in the habit of scanning every last page of a book as is, no matter kind of what it looks like. And that habit has reproduced a bright yellow due date slip on the front of the flyleaf. The slip is a story of the book's past. It reminds us that the book lived for a while at least until they shut it down in the Library and Information Science Library at Illinois. A handwritten notation near the top tells us that a library worker took this yellow slip, slid it along a glue dispensing wheel, and pasted it into this copy of Emerging Communities on July 5th, 1994. It tells us that this book wasn't hugely popular, but it was checked out at least 14 times before 2007. Right. We can see that on October 27th, 1994, the due date stamp failed, or it was dialed to the wrong date, or the library worker found a pen handier than the stamp. Right, you can see right there. Right. We can also see the very visible, very physical evidence that the slip's careful prescriptive design, these vertical lines, right, made no difference in the hustle and bustle of the library. Only 9 of the dates are anything approaching horizontal, and not a single one fits within those lines. Right. The messiness of human bodies and human minds once again impinges on this realm of digital information. And intriguingly, when something like this slip is OCR'd by the Internet Archive, the results are somewhat peculiar, right? And so, particularly fond of the notation telling us when it was checked in that says 7/5/94, I think, comes out asterisk dash NC, etc. And so we're reminded that even digitization projects that don't reproduce the page visually often involve artifacts of its physical history. So the next page, the verso of the front flyleaf, appears blank. No text, no stamps, no slips. Right? But it is not, in fact, blank. This image is not an absence, but a record of a certain sort of presence, because it's not an empty file. It's a high-resolution photograph of a piece of paper. Right? Piece of paper that had been pulped from trees, cut to size, and bound into this particular copy of Emerging Communities. And the image sits in the file as presently, as fully as the page it depicts sat in the original copy of the book. And moving past it still requires physical work, right, with the click of a mouse or the swipe of your finger in place of a grip and flip. But you still have to see it in order to move past it. So information is embodied, right? It's not bodiless. And when a book is digitized, what is reproduced and made widely accessible is a record of one way that knowledge was expressed physically in the world and the particular history of that particular way. And this is the case for the Internet Archive, but it's also the case for all digitization projects, which are unavoidably strangely material processes that record unavoidably strangely material texts. So now I want to turn to the second proposition I make today, that digitized books don't always stay digital. And this is a little bit more peculiar to the Internet Archive, as you'll see, but it has larger resonances that hopefully we will also see. So, according to Colley, one of the chief benefits of digitization is, surprisingly enough, that you can, quote, take the archives and the library stuff, digitize it and put it on the net, and then turn it back into paper. And you can imagine Licklider's horror at this. Right? Colley told the TED audience, I like the physical book. Quote, the idea of actually delivering books to people is, I think, a good thing. And how would he do it? How would he go from paper to digital data to paper again, delivering books to people who are scattered and bookless? Well, like generations before him, Colley turned to a bookmobile. And in doing so, he invested not only in the physical form of the book, but in the physical encounter of bodies and pages. So this bookmobile didn't actually carry any books, despite the claim of its 1 million books inside. Soon, I guess. I don't quite know what that's about. What it carried, instead, was the potential for books. It's a 1992 Ford Aerostar minivan sprouting a satellite dish. You can see it folded down on the top, and stuffed with a printer, a paper cutter, a bookbinding machine, and a knowledgeable staff. The bookmobile was, as Richard Koman, who wrote along on the bookmobile, called it, a van on a mission. And that mission was both the distribution of paper and the promotion of the public domain and print-on-demand technologies. In September 2002, the bookmobile set off on a cross-country trip, stopping at schools, libraries, and the US Supreme Court. And Colley was inspired largely by the Eldred v. Ashcroft case, in which Eric Eldred challenged the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. So the bookmobile's final stop on this trip was actually on the steps of the Supreme Court just before and during oral arguments in the case. This picture is from the night before. So, perhaps ironically, by digitizing books, Colley managed to make them even more physically involved. Because at each stop, the staff would help visitors use the bookmobile's technology to print, cut, and bind a public domain, Internet Archive digitized text into a book. Books weren't objects mysteriously made and transported from afar, and they weren't just bits and bytes transferred from a faraway server. They were the product of the reader's bodily interaction with data, paper, and machines, an extension of the body's paper and machines that, as we've seen, produced the data in the first place. The page persisted in the making of new pages by new hands. So promoting this power to create by hand, the bookmobile embodied a vision of what Koman called Insta-Book freedom. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given the way that American fantasies about freedom tend to work, the project had global ambitions as well. As, quote, sort of from the Silicon Valley sort of utopian, Colley told the TED audience, we thought, if we can make this technology work in rural Uganda, we might have something. And so Richard Koman, with funding from the World Bank, gave it a shot. Koman arrived with the zeal of generations of missionaries before him, but with the form of the book, not its content, as his gospel. But that actually turned out to be a problem. The project was less a response to concrete local desires than the product of a very American set of fantasies about technology and social change. Koman wrote shortly after the project, for example, of trying to put himself in the kids' heads as the bookmobile arrived at a school outside Kampala. Did they see this as simply a wonderful and fun day, or was this like a bookmobile from Mars? In the end, though, he declared, it didn't really matter. And since it didn't matter, it also didn't seem to matter what books they actually offered to this population. It was largely subsistence farmers and refugees. Right? They offered no books on farming. They offered no school books. They offered no scientific books of any kind. It was mostly late 19th century children's books. So convinced that the book itself, its physical form and manual construction, was the entire point, his project ignored the importance of what books actually had to say. And so one problem was that Koman and Colley tried to predict the afterlives of the digital data they produced. Who would want it, what form it would take, where it would go. And when they put their predictions into practice, promoting obscenely expensive print-on-demand equipment as a solution to underfunded school libraries, for example, or books like Through the Looking Glass as a solution to poverty and violence in Uganda, things didn't often go as planned. Right? Books don't always stay digital, but they might. The page may persist, but maybe not in the form we expect. The dead-set certainty of digital utopianism, whether it's paper-happy collies or paper-hating licklighters, can be at odds with the flexible and unpredictable needs of users, the ones who do things with data. So what I've talked about today have been in part historical oddities, right? The reemergence of the medieval scriptorium in the 21st century, the sometimes bizarre Internet Archive Bookmobile, but I think they've also illustrated risks and opportunities with significant impact on how criticism and analysis will be practiced as the digital humanities grow in influence and digitization increases in scope. And here are just two examples that come to my mind immediately. First is that if we don't notice how the page persists and sometimes returns in digital repositories, if we buy into the idea that digitization is abstraction, right, that it's just a way of getting information, right, then we can miss opportunities for book historical and bibliographical and material culture analyses of digitized texts, alongside our close readings, our distant readings, our data mining. So for example, we might ask, what is the material culture of digitization? Right? And that's something I've started to think through here. Second, if in focusing on its product, we don't see digitization as a process, and a rather material one at that, we'll fail to understand the history of our own tools and practices, which will hamper our ability to use them effectively in an uncertain future. So the page persists, often in unpredictable ways, but I think one thing is pretty clear. We should, to licklighters abiding horror, expect to be embarrassed by paper for quite a bit longer. Thank you.
I just have a comment. It'll be interesting, like one of those kids in Uganda with a copy of Through the Looking Glass will become, like the finance minister, and then have an archive later, and then somebody will digitize all their books, and then that book that was printed out from a digitized version will then be digitized again. Just food for thought.
I think that's conceivable, actually, absolutely, given the way the Internet Archive, like Google Books, right, just sort of sucks up books somewhat uncritically in some cases.
I actually consider that the process from digital to the material seems to be the dominant form right now. I wouldn't call it the exception, since most authors, academics, or otherwise, today go from digital to material. I wonder if you could incorporate that into making this into an exceptional case.
So, going from digital to materials, you mean like
Microsoft Word
yeah.
to Oxford Press.
Yes.
Yes, and then that involves a lot of trucks, a lot more trucks than this, to distribute that paper all over the world. Because these are industries that are immense, that have an immense materiality attached to them.
Absolutely.
Incorporate.
I can give it a shot. Definitely. So, right, that's actually another way that the material page persists, right? That just as the manuscript didn't become print, right? It wasn't it's manuscript, today, and everything is in print tomorrow. The transition between material paper books, right, and digital books, of thinking apart about ebooks, in this case, are unpredictable, right? So, my favorite stories about this is one of the middle of the series Harry Potter books, right, was printed books in such a way that it delayed the production of other books later on, not because they didn't want to come out on the same day, but because it actually used up all of the paper that was appropriate for printing books on that day. Right? And so they had to actually delay the production of a number of other books for a while. Right? And so there are all of these little messy things. Or my students, right? I have most of their readings on a Moodle page, right? But I have to nudge them. Actually, I want them to print them out, a lot of them, because otherwise they'll bring the computer and be my Facebook and I, rather than our class readings and us. But I think, yes, I don't think the Internet Archive is singular in this relationship. I think the peculiarity is in Kali's dream of taking paper, putting it online in order to make paper again, which I think isn't the typical way people think about digitizing, even if that's sometimes how it gets practiced.
I'll push that just 1 second if the audience is patient with me. In the developing world, in the global south, where electricity is iffy, I know many writers who write on paper. When the light comes on around 4 p.m., they can turn on their computers. They quickly type it out, and then that eventually goes to a press again. So I get your point, which is the move from material to digital to back to material. And I would say also that move is actually also dominant in large swaths of the world today when it comes to the production of literary text.
Though I do think in this case, right, what they're doing and the digitization is in a kind of a post-production process, right? It's not the creating, at least the way they think about it, it's not creating new ideas. It's not like an author writing something. It's taking something an idea that's already in paper, putting it online, and then returning it to paper. So it's a kind of a time shift, slightly. But I think that's a great point.
Along those lines, so I've been looking at a lot of print-on-demand books recently of a single text and multiple print-on-demand versions of it, and find that you'll find them being printed with books that were digitized that originally had underlining in them, so you're getting it reprinted with the script of someone else, which I think is maybe a historical difference, although a lot of materials are more digital. I was wondering if copyright might throw a kind of interesting wrench into this whole thing, or at least be another vector that we could look at this from, in that copyright in this situation might become a new form of colonialism, precisely because we can only be sending out late 19th century texts that present a particular vision of the world.
Yeah. So the Internet Archive only digitizes public domain books, right? Because unlike Google Books, they aren't monetizing. But I think insofar as Brewster Colley's public domain evangelism has failed, right? Eric V. Ashcroft is decided in favor of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, right? That these limitations absolutely continue and affect a lot of actually these global efforts, like but unlike the Internet Archive Bookmobile in Uganda. I lost track of where I was going. But I think it does raise a very interesting set of questions about what a shared culture can be. Right? The Internet Archive is trying to curate a shared patrimony, but it's a shared patrimony that isn't in copyright. Right? And so the recent past, right, literature, right, after, say, the era of canon busting, right, isn't in the Internet Archive. Right? Slave narratives that were discovered later or weren't printed very often early on aren't in the Internet Archive. Though as they try to digitize manuscripts and all of that, changes things a little. But I think that's actually a really important part of thinking about the Internet Archive as distinct from, say, Google Books. Right? The Internet Archive is aiming for universal, for total, but because of legal challenges, right, and the way that governments control culture, can't actually do that.
Thank you, Derek.